Welcome guys, welcome back to another one of my historical videos. It's your host, Minkai. Welcome to Minko's Corner once again. Today we're going to do a reaction on the War of the Roses. Now, this is just the part one. I'm going to cut the video in half because it's a 53-minute video and, I'm going to do it in half. So, I'm going to do like 25 minutes and then 25 afterwards. The War of the Roses. Now, that's a conflict that basically spanned it truly started, if you want to be accurate, with the death of Henry V. With it didn't start in 1455 to 1487. Well, quote unquote did, but it really didn't. It started all the way. There's so many different storylines that interconnect. I know a lot about the conflict. I've read a few books about the conflict, and so for the first time, this video I'll be able to give nuggets of knowledge. So stay tuned and let's go in.
Wars often happen because different sides have intractable contradictions, but each new war often creates the causes for the next one. The Hundred Years' War between England and France was no different, causing many conflicts in Europe. In England, the Wars of the Roses stemmed from the Hundred Years' War. Shout out to Conqueror's Blade for sponsoring this video. Conqueror's Blade is a tactical MMORPG strategy.
Let's skip this. Let's skip Conqueror's Blade. I don't know.
The King of England, Edward III, had 5 sons who survived into adulthood. For the first time in English history, he created duchies for them, making his sons the biggest landowners in the country. On the one hand, this strengthened the crown.
As you can see right away, the important ones are the ones with portraits. Basically the whole story of the War of the Roses is the following. The Black Prince, the first son of Edward III, had a son of his own called Richard. And the Black Prince was an incredible fighter, incredible warrior. He was out there. He was just very charismatic, very ruthless, but he was, a very good king, or a very good heir to the throne, so to speak. He ended up dying. And then his son ended up taking over, Richard II, who was deposed. And then basically the War of the Roses is basically the fight between two families, the Lancasters and the Yorkists. And what's ironic is that they were fighting for control and whose family is gonna inherit and rule the throne of England. And at the end, none of them do. Both families get extinct, and a new family comes up and takes the throne called the Tudor family. The Tudors are basically it's complicated, but basically they descend from the Lancaster side of the family, but they were like bastard born and then legitimized, and it's a whole thing. I hope they're going to explain it, and I can go more into detail.
But at the same time, it formed a new class of nobility, which had claims to the throne and enough power to vie for it.
Yeah.
Edward's son and heir, the famous Hundred Years' War commander Edward the Black Prince, passed away in 1376, followed by the king himself a year later. The Black Prince's son was crowned as Richard II. The reign of this monarch was tumultuous. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was followed by the parliamentary crisis of 1386 to 1388. Richard's attempts to reach peace with France, his marriage to the young Valois princess, the lack of an heir, and the constant strife with the nobility made him deeply unpopular. Richard's cousin and one of the most powerful lords, the Duke of Lancaster Henry Bolingbroke, was exiled to France in 1398. In May of 1399, Richard embarked on a campaign in Ireland, and Henry used the opportunity to return to England. He immediately garnered enough support to dethrone Richard and assumed the throne as Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king. Richard was arrested and died in 1400, while his heir presumptive, another grandson of Edward III.
Basically what happens is, the reason why there's a War of the Roses in the first place is because, the two families, obviously, but it's more than that. It's the erosion of royal authority. What I mean by that? What I mean is, normally the way it happens is, you have a king, he has a first son, that son, or the son's son, will inherit the throne. But during the 15th century, it starts here actually, but more so in the 15th century, the throne starts changing hands not because of inheritance, but because of show of force, of army, of strength. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why does it erode royal authority? Well, if you're a king, let's take an example, like Edward IV, for example, who takes the throne from Henry VI. Your position is never truly stable because, yes, you're the king, you're powerful. But what if you took the throne with an army? It sets a precedent that somebody else with a bigger army can take the throne. And it goes on and on and on.
Third, Edmund Mortimer, was bypassed. That created legitimacy problems for the king, and he faced at least 6 significant rebellions.
The Percies, man,
In 1413, Henry IV succumbed to chronic disease and was succeeded by his son Henry V.
One of the most.
The new king was one of the most talented monarchs of England.
Yeah, he really was. He was a military genius, and he ends up claiming the whole of it. He basically claims half of France, and he's supposed to become the. I'm sorry I'm pausing so much. I'm just excited because I know so much about the subject and I can talk about it. Otherwise, after the First World War, I don't know that much. But he ends up going to France, and he ends up getting a treaty signed in Troyes, with Charles VI. Charles VI by now is he's crazy. He's mad. He's known as the Mad King, and basically there's an understanding that when he dies, the crown won't go to his son and heir, but will go to Henry V. There's a treaty. But what ends up happening is Henry V dies, and 3 months later, Charles VI dies. So, like his newborn son, Henry VI, he's a much better claim to the throne of England, but nobody recognizes to the throne of France. But nobody recognizes it's a whole thing.
During this era. In 1415, he renewed hostilities with France and won an impressive victory at Agincourt.
Crazy battle.
In less than a decade, he conquered more French land than any English king before him.
Yeah.
The Treaty of Troyes was signed with France in 1420.
I'm not sure that Orléans ever falls, because Orléans, the city, is about to fall, but it gets saved by Jeanne d'Arc. This very peasant woman who was a military who was sent from God. It's a whole thing, and she ends up getting burned alive.
According to which Henry married French Princess Catherine.
Yeah.
Their descendants would inherit the French throne after the death of Charles VI the Mad. Both sovereigns passed away in 1422.
Yeah, within months of each other.
Henry V's son, Henry VI, who was less than 1 year old, was crowned as the King of England.
Yeah.
The king's uncle, John of Bedford, became the regent.
Now, I have to say this. Henry VI, he was in such a, you might think he was a horrible position. An infant who has a regency, it never ends well for him, right? Yeah, but in this case it was special because there were so many powerful people. He had a bunch of uncles that were, very, very strong, and they were military leaders, and he was protected. He wasn't gonna get usurped, like we'll see a little bit down the line. He was protected, and he survived. Nobody wanted a civil war at that time in England, and Henry V cast such a long shadow. He had so much prestige he gave to his son that it wasn't happening.
Regent and took command in France, while his other uncle, Humphrey of Gloucester, looked after English affairs.
Yeah, Humphrey.
Although Bedford was a decent commander, the French soon rallied around Joan of Arc, and Charles VII was crowned as King of France in Rheims.
Yeah.
Henry's coronation in Paris was a mere symbol.
Yeah, Henry.
By the time Henry reached
Henry VI went to Paris when he was 3 to get crowned, but he was very dangerous and he didn't stay that long. He bounced.
Adulthood and started governing in 1437, Bedford was dead and the situation in France was untenable.
Yeah.
The king was weak and easily swayed by his nobles.
He was really
and at that
swayed.
point, the peace party, led by Edmund of Somerset and William of Suffolk, had more influence on the...
Keep an eye on this guy, Richard of York. Just keep an eye on him. It gets interesting.
king than the war party of Gloucester and Richard of York. The sides agreed to peace at Tours in 1444. Yeah. According to their agreement, Henry was to marry Charles' niece, Margaret of Anjou.
Margaret of Anjou. Now, you have to... do you guys remember Catherine de Valois? The woman that married... I may be skipping here, but I think it's important. The woman that married Henry V, a few minutes earlier, she remarries in secret to Owen Tudor. You know how I mentioned the Tudor dynasty? That's important.
And return men and Anjou to France. The marriage and the peace conditions were unpopular in England. Among those who protested was Gloucester, and that gave Henry a chance to imprison his uncle in 1447. Gloucester died shortly after, and this weakened the war party even more.
Gloucester really got screwed.
Richard, who commanded the English lands in France, was stripped of his office and sent to govern Ireland, which was an exile. Somerset and Suffolk became dukes in this period. However, Suffolk was exiled under popular pressure and then murdered. Hostilities with France were renewed, and Somerset, who was appointed the commander in Normandy, lost all the northern holdings save for Calais by 1450
Calais
and
is
returned to England.
Remain in English hands for quite a while.
He and Queen Margaret had the king under their influence. The prestige of the monarchy was at an all-time low.
Yeah, it was.
The 100 Years' War impoverished England, the losses in France were hard to swallow, and the nobles who had lost their land on the continent were unhappy. At the same time, all the duchies created in the last century had become too strong and independent, and
Henry VI was an extremely weak king. He was a good guy. He was pious, he was nice. He was nice. That's the problem. Sometimes being nice. I mean, you might think, he was a nice guy, he was pious, he was very religious. You might think that kind of figure would, be good for a country. But he ends up causing so much death because of his ineptitude that...
The dukes often had personal retinues larger than that of the king.
Yeah.
At this point, it is essential to show you the family tree.
That's a beautiful, beautiful... Oh, this is gonna be... Okay, so as you can see, Edward III, he has 5 sons, right? But a few, just a few are important. So you have Duke of Cornwall. This is the Black Prince, who has a son, Richard II, who married a French princess, but he gets deposed by Henry IV. Henry IV comes from the Dukes of Lancaster, the Lancasters. Then you have the Beauforts that were on this side. They were legitimized. That's important. The way it happened is very, very interesting. Basically, John of Gaunt had a bunch of children with the first wife, and then a bunch with his mistress, who ended up legitimizing. And those are the Beauforts, legitimized male heirs. Then you have the Dukes of York. That's another branch of the family, and as you can see,
of the Plantagenet dynasty, as many grandsons of Edward III controlled these duchies, ushering in the era of what is controversially known as bastard feudalism. This era was characterized by the loyalty of the soldiers being to their lords rather than the king.
Yep.
The nobles would use that to procure offices, lands, and finances from the king. These lords and their heirs would play a central role throughout the Wars of the Roses.
Here comes Richard.
Richard, who had a strong claim to the throne as a great-grandson of Edward III, used the circumstances to return from exile in 1452. Although many came to his banner and demanded Somerset's arrest, the Queen's party was still stronger, and Margaret's pregnancy made her position even more secure. The situation would change in 1453. Affected by the loss of Bordeaux and Aquitaine, the king suffered a mental breakdown and became unresponsive.
Yeah, the guy just does things just to fuck things up. So what happens is he goes, bye-bye mentally. He just goes crazy. And then just when things are about to become, because Richard of York, even though he's portrayed as someone who wants the throne, the power, he was doing it because he wanted to help the country stabilize. Just to an extent. At some point he gets rejected so many times, he gets banished, and at some point he gets afraid of death. That Margaret, the wife of Henry VI, was going to kill him. So that's when he starts vying for the throne. That's later.
Scholars still argue about the nature of this illness, but it is clear that Henry VI lost the remainder of his political power.
Yeah.
In the north, two noble families, the Nevilles and Percys, used the lack of central power to renew a feud, and as Somerset supported the latter, the Nevilles allied with Richard.
Yeah.
By 1454, Richard had enough backing to become the royal protector and appoint his supporters to offices, while Somerset was arrested.
It didn't last, though.
However, in 1455, the king recovered, and Queen Margaret managed to influence him yet again. Richard's decisions were rolled back, and he was exiled. This time, the Duke of York wasn't going to take it, and he raised an army to move to London. The conflict that would later be called the Wars of the Roses because of the heraldic badges used by the Lancasters and the Yorks became inevitable. Henry knew that he would receive no support in London and moved out to a town called St Albans with his 2,000 men, where an at least 5,000 strong Yorkist army was waiting for him.
He loses.
Richard wasn't ready to dethrone Henry.
It was a bloody battle. So there weren't that many casualties, but a lot of important people died.
So negotiations started, but as the latter refused to surrender Somerset, the Yorkists attacked. The Lancastrian army, led in battle by the Duke of Buckingham, took up positions around St Albans' defences, primarily the gates on Sopwell and Shropshire Lanes, while the king was in the market square. Meanwhile, York's army drew up in a line east of the town on the Quay Field, behind the gardens of Holywell Street, the Market Square and St Peter's Square. At 10 AM, Warwick, Salisbury and York simultaneously attacked the gates on both Shropshire and Sopwell Lane. Due to its unexpected and swift nature, the attack succeeded at first, with the Yorkists pushing onto the city streets. However, as it became apparent that an attack was taking place, more men rushed to defend these strongpoints, and the narrow streets caused the mass of Yorkists to suffer heavy losses. As the fighting threatened to bog down into a grinding stalemate, the Earl of Warwick disengaged from the battle and rode to the rear, where a rearguard was waiting in reserve.
Yeah.
He then led them in a flanking maneuver through the gardens near the market square, successfully remaining undetected as he did so. With a blast from his trumpeteers, the 25-year-old Warwick charged and smashed the surprised Lancastrian line in two. Hearing of this breach and fearing an attack from their rear, the defenders at the gate now broke their lines and fled towards the market square. More Yorkist forces now entered the city through the undefended gates. In the square, the Lancastrian remnants attempted to rally, but were prevented from doing so by the devastating short-range fire of Yorkist archers, who continually showered the remaining Lancastrians with missiles. Many Lancastrian commanders, among them Somerset, were killed, while the king was captured.
Yeah.
Richard returned him to London and was appointed the Protector by Parliament. By that time, Margaret gave birth to Edward and became the leader of the Lancastrian party.
There are so many Edwards that are born. You'll see.
It seemed that both sides were shocked by St Albans, as hostilities continued only in the form of the Percy-Neville feud between 1456 and 1459. Henry attempted to reconcile the parties on a few occasions, but the suspicions were too strong, and in the fall of 1459 the sides clashed once again. This time the Lancastrians gained the upper hand, and the Yorkists were forced to find refuge in Calais and Ireland.
Oh, I remember this.
The Yorkists recovered quickly and returned to England.
The wife, Cicely Neville of Richard of York, ended up staying actually. She ended up surrendering with her son.
In the summer of 1460. The king's forces were defeated at Northampton and Henry was captured.
Yeah.
Richard attempted to claim the throne, but even his staunchest supporters refused. Instead, the so-called Act of Accord was adopted, according to which Henry VI would rule for life, but would be succeeded by Richard of York.
Yeah. Here we go.
The Queen
Owen
was
Tudor.
willing.
You have to understand, Owen Tudor ended up marrying the widowed wife of Henry V, which is a baller move. I mean, the guy's nobody. Now he has his family, they have ancestral ties in Wales. Other than that, they're nobody.
To fight for her son's inheritance and was gathering her forces in the north.
Yeah.
Richard moved towards the Lancastrian troops to prevent their recruitment.
This is a huge mistake from Richard's part. Richard of York ends up going, and nobody knows why, he ends up going into a battle 5-1. This whole thing, he ends up, spoiler alert, he ends up dying with his son on the battle.
Efforts, but his enemies were already on the way, and their 18,000 blockaded his 5,000 to 10,000 strong force near Sandal Castle.
Yeah.
What happened next is still debated, but his next move was an attempt to sally out of the castle and attack the Lancastrian forces, a move which seems in hindsight to have been incredibly ill-advised and rash.
It was idiotic.
Many scholars have attempted to explain this move by Richard. Theories range from simple miscalculation and rashness on Richard's part to Lancastrian trickery. It is said that Sir Andrew Trollope sent pretend deserters to Sandal Castle, proclaiming that their former commander was going to change sides. The Lancastrian forces also apparently showed false colours in order to trick Richard of York into thinking his reinforcements had arrived. Whatever prompted it, Richard chose to ride out from the castle and fight, rather than withstanding the trials of a siege, which would further deplete his provisions. After marching down the modern-day Many Gates Lane towards the Lancastrian forces, who were to the north, York was cut off from his castle from behind and surrounded, while he engaged the enemy to his front. His numerically inferior forces were soundly defeated, and York himself was killed, probably being unhorsed, wounded and killed during a fight to the death. In early 1461, his son Edward became the leader of the Yorkists.
Yep.
In February, he defeated a Lancastrian army at Mortimer's Cross. Meanwhile,
So there was two battles that were very important. One was the Battle of Mortimer's Cross that Edward of York wins, and the other, which Richard of Warwick. There's the second Battle of St. Albans that Warwick loses. So things are pretty equal.
A smaller Yorkist force under Warwick was defeated at St. Albans by the army commanded by the Queen.
Yep.
Henry VI was recaptured by the...
And what happens is Margaret of Anjou with Henry VI attempts to go into London, but the Londoners are afraid because there's a lot of propaganda being basically washed over the realm by Edward of York that Margaret of Anjou's army are barbarians, they're going to rape your city, whereas in fact they were really disciplined. But there was a lot of propaganda, it played a huge part, they barred entry to her and she ended up leaving.
Lancastrians. Edward learned about this defeat and moved south, where he united with the remainder of Warwick's troops. As Lancastrian soldiers committed atrocities in the area, Margaret and Henry lost all their support and decided to move to the north. That allowed Edward to enter London in March and take the throne as Edward IV.
Yeah.
The showdown was imminent. Both sides continued to recruit troops over the next few weeks. Edward left London on the 13th and arrived in Nottingham on the 22nd. Here he received the news that 30,000 to 35,000 Lancastrian...
The Battle of Towtown. This battle is insane because it's basically 120,000 people on the battlefield. Between 100 and 120, and 30,000 people die. 28,000. people lay dead on that battlefield. It was one of the bloodiest English battle for a long while.
Troops, commanded by Somerset, were to the south of the city of York. Edward had less than 30,000.
What?
On the 28th of March, King Edward sent Fitzwalter to secure the bridge over the Aire River near Ferrybridge. However, Fitzwalter was ambushed by Clifford's cavalry. Many Yorkists were massacred or drowned.
Am I making a mistake?
King Henry had sent a messenger to negotiate, but his offer was refused. Edward knew that the main Lancastrian force led by Somerset was waiting 2 miles away, ready to crush the Yorkists if they pushed Clifford away and crossed the river. He sent a vanguard under Suffolk, which managed to push the Lancastrians back to the end of the bridge. Edward then marched with the main force to Ferrybridge and led his men personally to Suffolk's aid. To stop the Yorkist advance, the Lancastrians destroyed the bridge, but the former constructed a narrow raft to ferry across. This raft was captured by the Lancastrians, and the fight continued in the area for some time until the Yorkists managed to cross the river to the north at Castleford and set up camp.
Am I making a mistake here? I might have skipped a few years.
On the 29th of March, both armies
No, okay, I'm not crazy. I was like, am I going nuts? I'm not. Good thought on here.
found themselves in a snowstorm. At 11 in the morning, the Yorkists marched northward and encamped on the hill 10 miles south of York, with their backs to the village of Saxton. Edward put his men in formation. Their lines stretched for a mile along the ridge. At the same time, the Lancastrians moved north and took positions to the north of the Yorkists on high ground 100 feet above them on the meadowland to the south of Towton. Part of their cavalry was hidden in the forest to the west of the Yorkist positions. The Lancastrians had the advantage of the high ground. The Yorkist position was shaky, as any retreat would trap them along the river. Edward had artillery, but the weather conditions did not allow its usage.
Yeah.
Somerset didn't want to descend from the high ground and waited for the Yorkists to approach. The battle started with archers exchanging volleys. However, the wind was blowing into the face of the Lancastrian archers, and they were unable to see the enemy properly. Their arrows fell short of the mark, and according to the sources, all they could hear through the whirlwind was the laughter of their counterparts. A hail of counter-volleys accompanied this. The Yorkists were gathering thousands of enemy arrows and were firing them back at them, retreating after each volley to avoid the return fire. The Lancastrians suffered heavy losses and were forced to descend from the hill, taking up melee weapons and charging. The Yorkist archers sent a few more volleys and then retreated behind their men-at-arms. As the main Lancaster force charged into the Yorkist army, a fierce melee began across the line.
Yeah.
At the same time, the hidden flanking force attacked the left flank of Edward's army, did significant damage and almost routed it. Edward himself led the reserves and stabilized the situation on the left side. Still, the Lancastrians outnumbered their enemies and slowly pushed them back.
It was a really bloody battle.
It was then that the forces sent by Norfolk to assist Edward arrived. It is not clear if Edward gave an order or if the commander of this unit took the initiative, but these troops attacked the Lancastrians in the flank. Soon Henry's forces were routed. Sources claim that 20,000 Lancastrians and up to 10,000 Yorkists were killed, making Towton the bloodiest battle fought on English soil.
It really was a bloody one.
After the decisive victory at Towton in 1461, Edward IV returned to London for his coronation, while Henry VI, alongside his wife Margaret and son Edward, fled to Scotland.
Yeah.
The Lancastrian party still controlled part of Northumberland, and Edward left Richard of Warwick, aptly named the Kingmaker for his role in the rise of the Yorks, to deal with the last remnants of the resistance. By 1463, Warwick retook all of the castles belonging to the Lancastrian nobles and returned to the south. As Edward's position was strong, he decided to forgive some of his past enemies, among them Henry Somerset and Ralph Percy. King Edward was wary that the Scots supported the Lancasters throughout the first phase of the war, so in 1463 he asked James III to sign a treaty.
Now, I have to say this. You have to understand that Edward IV has a couple of brothers. He has George, Duke of Clarence, which is a fucking moron, and you have Richard, Duke of York, and he's an interesting one, that's for sure. Duke of Gloucester, or of York, I don't know, one of the two.
The Scots agreed and sent their diplomats to York in 1464. To prevent the agreement from happening, Lancastrian nobles, nudged by Queen Margaret, rebelled in 1464 under the leadership of Somerset and Percy in Northumberland.
Henry VI, moron.
Edward sent a force led by Warwick's brother, John Neville, to the north, and in May he defeated Somerset at Hexham. All Lancastrian leaders were killed, which ended the rebellion for good.
Yeah.
The treaty with the Scots was signed and Queen Margaret and Prince Edward escaped to France to their relative King Louis XI. In 1465, Henry VI was captured in Lancashire and brought to London, which ushered in a short period of peace in England.
He was captured, but he wasn't killed. Now, Henry VI was not murdered, which Edward IV will end up regretting down the line because things will happen. But you know, this period in history is extremely interesting because now you think everything is over. Edward IV, he has complete control over England. Everything's peachy. Now there will be a diplomatic fuck up, if you will. That will happen.
During this time, Richard Warwick became even more powerful, assuming many offices and taking lands from the Lancastrians. He tried to assert influence over the young king, and he saw negotiations with Louis in 1466 as one of the ways to do it. Warwick tried to marry Edward with the daughter of the French king, Anne, and this is when a secret came out. The king had privately married.
He was married already to Elizabeth Woodville. Huge mistake. Huge mistake, because it was a mistake and not so as well. Because on one side, yes, her family was somewhat prominent in England, but if he married the sister of Louis XI, he might have secured external alliances, and that would play, I believe, a huge role into this. Is huge spoilers. Edward IV ends up dying, and his throne ends up getting usurped by his brother, Richard III. And both of his sons were murdered by his brother. Which, his brother, by the way, was one of the most loyal and steadfast leaders of the time. And he turns, it's not as cut and clear as, I'm evil, I'm going to kill my nephews, I'm going to take it. There's a little bit more politics behind it, intrigue. But it's very interesting. And now, there was he could have married a Burgundian princess, a French princess. There was even in Scotland he could have, but
married Elizabeth Woodville in 1464. And the fact that she was from the lower nobility shocked the magnates. On top of that, Edward entered a secret alliance with the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, negating Warwick's negotiations with Louis and embarrassing him. Warwick left the court in 1467 and started plotting against the king. In 1469, one of his captains started a rebellion in the north. Edward moved to Nottingham in the early days of July, but upon learning that the rebels outnumbered him, decided to wait for reinforcements.
Smart.
However, Warwick entered London a few days after and declared for the rebels alongside his son-in-law, the king's brother, George.
Now, Edward IV is, on all sides, he's getting, ambushed, so to speak. But, he survived this.
The rebels managed to bypass Nottingham and attacked the royal reinforcements at a place called Edgecote Moor. Supported by Warwick's troops, the rebels routed the forces of the king. Edward was captured on his way back to London. Warwick's attempt to rule in the king's name or even dethrone him failed, as Edward was still very popular among the nobility and the commoners. Rebellions forced Warwick to release the king, and he ended up with even less influence over governance than before. So Warwick decided to instigate another rebellion in Lincolnshire in March of 1470. This time the king moved swiftly, not allowing the rebels to connect with Warwick. At Losecoat Field, Edward's outnumbered army defeated and routed the rebels. This forced Warwick to flee to France, where Louis reconciled him with Queen Margaret. Kingmaker was going to restore Henry VI, who by now wasn't in possession of his faculties, to the English throne using French support. In September, Warwick landed in Devon. Initially, Edward was planning to march against him, but Warwick's brother John, who had remained loyal to the king until now, finally rebelled, and Edward had no other choice but to leave England. In October, Warwick entered London and restored Henry to the throne.
It's not gonna last though.
Meanwhile, Edward found refuge in Flanders, which was under the control of Charles the Brave. Although the help he received from Burgundy was minimal, Edward returned to England in March of 1471. Edward used deceit, stating that he was not vying for the throne and had come back to reclaim the Duchy of York.
He basically says, I'm not vying for the throne, I'm not here for the throne. He ends up amassing a huge army because everybody's like, oh, he's not fighting for the throne, he's here, to proclaim his loyalty. Bullshit. He gets the army, gets up close to London, and then he's like, by the way, I'm vying for the throne.
The city of York allowed him to enter, and soon he started his march towards London, receiving reinforcements along the way. Even his disloyal brother George rejoined him.
George of Clarence. Dude, that guy, man. Talk about a moron, okay? Because the guy, he's the middle brother between Edward IV, who became king, and then his brother, Richard of York, who was an incredible military leader. He was very much trusted, he was very powerful, he was a good military commander, and so he was the middle brother. And so he was a moron. That's one thing,
It seems that Warwick was waiting for aid from his allies in England and France, so he avoided battle, as it was expected that Edmund Somerset would defend the capital. However, the Londoners preferred Edward, and Somerset was forced to leave, either to avoid rebellion or to unite with Margaret, who was going to land in Dorset. Edward took control of the city and captured Henry VI yet again.
Henry VI.
Edward had between 10 and 15,000 men, and was outnumbered by Warwick's army, which had more than 20,000. But he knew that he needed to attack before more reinforcements could join his enemy from the south. Warwick was probably hoping to block the road to the north, as on the 12th of April his troops took a position to the north of London at a place called Barnet.
Yeah, the Battle of Barnet.
The Yorkist army arrived on the evening of the 13th, and Edward positioned his troops in the dark, planning to take his stand at dawn. It is said that Edward made a mistake in the dark, underestimating the distance between the two armies, and moved his troops closer to those of Warwick than he had intended.
You're gonna see what happens. This battle is hilarious.
Fortunate, as the Lancastrians, who were using their artillery to weaken their enemy, were overshooting Edward's troops, who moved through most of the night to take up positions. He deployed Hastings on the left, and his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, aged 18.
I was mistaken. He's not the Duke of York, Duke of Gloucester. That's right.
At the time, on the right, while George was to stay with him in the centre. A small reserve was stationed behind the main line.
I was mistaken.
Opposite them, Warwick and his brother John Neville commanded the centre, with Exeter on the left side and Oxford on the right. The Lancastrian knights were dismounted, as that usually showed that they weren't going to retreat and would fight among the commoners until the very end.
Which is stupid. Giving yourself a disadvantage.
As the morning of April 14th dawned, a mist engulfed the battlefield. The armies failed to line up parallel to each other, with both ending up in a slight oblique formation in relation to the enemy. The Lancastrians had numbers, so this at first worked to their advantage. Oxford's unit attacked the flank of Edward's army. Hastings' troops were soon overwhelmed. Many of them died during the retreat, while the remainder fled all the way to London, claiming that Edward had already lost the battle. Unfortunately for Warwick, a big part of Oxford's unit remained detached from the battle, as they attempted to loot their fallen enemies, with only part of it returning to the fight.
Oh my god.
As visibility was still poor, neither side knew about these events. Meanwhile, Gloucester repeated Oxford's manoeuvre, attacking the Lancastrian left and pushing Exeter's troops back. This shifted the lines yet again. Warwick, aware of this, ordered his reserves to support Exeter and restore the formation, while his forces moved against the enemy's centre, and the lines finally joined. It is said that the remainder of Oxford's troops returned to the battle at this point, and in the mist ended up behind the reserves commanded by John Neville, which were sent to support Exeter. Apparently, Oxford's coat of arms with stars on it was mistaken for Edward's banner with the sun on it. The panicked forces of Neville turned towards Oxford's troops and unleashed their bows, killing many of their comrades. As backstabbing was so common during this period, Oxford and his men cried treason and started retreating to the north. This cry resonated across the Lancastrian line, which ended up in disarray. At this point, the fog started to dissipate, and Edward, seeing his enemies panicked, sent in his reserves to move across the right side and attack the Lancastrians from the flank and rear. Soon Warwick and Neville were killed, while Exeter was captured.
Normally Warwick himself was on a horse, but his brother ended up convincing him to be on foot this battle. So he started running, but he couldn't make it far. He ends up getting captured, actually. What happens is, unless I'm mistaken with someone else, but I don't think I am, I think he ends up surviving the battle and fleeing through the woods, or I think I'm completely mistaken with someone else. I might be, so I'm gonna pause here.
5 and 10,000 Lancastrians were dead, while the Yorkists lost less than 1,000. Unfortunately for Edward, while this battle was raging, Queen Margaret and her son, Prince Edward, landed in Dorset and were greeted by Somerset. Edward dismissed most of his troops and returned to London, then learned about the arrival of Margaret to...
Alright guys, I'm gonna pause it here. Tell me in the comments if you liked my reaction. This is part 1. I'm gonna make this video in 2 parts because it's very long. I hope you like my reaction, guys. If you do, leave a like, subscribe, and all that. We're close to 100 subscribers. We're 93 last I checked, so let's get this number going. And I'll see you guys next time. Thank you for watching. See ya.